A guy named Mike emailed me. He told me he's a retired Marine and nothing really scares him except for the time that he went camping in the woods in the mountains with his friend and he experienced something he still can't explain and that still scares him to this day. I'm actually filming this story while we're at a cabin in the woods in the Smoky Mountains. So look at this creepy little building in our yard. Anyway, Mike said he's shared the story with his friends before, but some of them have made fun of him for being scared, but he says he knows what he experienced and he knows that it was something supernatural in nature. I had to come inside. It was too windy out there. So Mike said the reason that he went on this camping trip was it was supposed to be a hunting trip with one of his buddies who he was in the Marine Corps with. He said he's hiked, he's camped, he's fished, he spent time in the wilderness by himself. Nothing really scares him. He's been in foreign countries, has a background of being a badass, basically. Mike said he was really excited to go on this trip because he was going through a divorce at the time. He had 2 daughters and his ex took them that weekend on a family trip, and it was the first family trip that Mike did not go on. So when his buddy extended the invite for this camping trip, he was like, hell yeah, I'll go. They spend the first day out there making camp, basically. They pitch a tent, they build a fire, and they're just hanging out, and they figure they're gonna start hunting the next day. Sun goes down, they're camping, laughing, talking around the fire. All of a sudden, through the trees, there's this wind, and then the wind stops, and it's just dead silent, and him and his buddy kind of looked at each other. In the silence, they hear rustling, and it sounds like somebody is walking back and forth, like pacing, and he said it was very clearly a person on 2 legs. The way that he described it is he said that animals have like a dirtier sound when they move, like they're lower to the ground, you can hear more than 2 legs moving, but he said this was distinctly 2 legs. Then through the trees, they hear a very loud wail that sounds like a baby crying, and Mike and his friend are like, oh, it's just a bobcat. He said bobcats sound a lot like babies. The bobcat cry stops, it was in the distance, but then they heard the rustling again, and it sounded like it was coming right from behind their tent. So it sounded like someone was walking back and forth, but then all of a sudden the pace picked up, and it sounded like someone was running back and forth. Mike's buddy stands up, he's like, I'm gonna go check it out. He grabs his pew-pew and he walks behind the tent. As he's walking around the tent, the pacing stops. Mike calls to him, he's like, you see anything back there? His buddy's like, no, all clear. Mike gets up, he puts another log in the fire, they go back and resume what they're doing. About an hour later, they decide to go to bed. They put out the fire, they go in the tent, they zip it up, they're going to sleep. He said as he was drifting off into bed, he heard the rustling pick up again behind the tent, and then it sounded like someone ran into the forest. He said every hair on his body stood up when he heard this because it meant that whoever was behind the tent had been there the entire time when Mike's buddy went to check it out, the whole time they were by the fire, and when they chose to go in the tent and go to bed. He sleeps with his pew-pew next to him just in case, but he convinces himself that it was just an animal. He falls asleep. A couple hours later, he doesn't know what time. He said it was still dark outside, but he felt like the energy changed in the tent. He sits up, it's still dark, it's silent in the woods. He's looking at his buddy's still asleep in the sleeping bag, and all of a sudden, as he's looking at him, his buddy sits straight up in his sleeping bag, looks at Mike and says, who are you? Mike's staring at his buddy's staring at him with this look of horror and shock across his face, and then they hear the baby cry again. Mike said this one didn't sound like a bobcat, it sounded like a baby was crying right outside their tent. Mike grabs his pew-pew, he's like, I'm gonna go check it out. He unzips the tent, he goes outside, there's nothing there. He said he could not sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, he left the tent, he went to look for tracks, and there was nothing. The camp was untouched. He says he still doesn't know what was out in the woods that night, and when he asked his buddy about why he asked him, who are you, his buddy has no recollection of ever waking up or hearing anything in the middle of the night. He said they did go hunting that day, but they did not camp again that night. They packed it up and they left. Mike said he's familiar with the mountains, but he's not familiar with mountain lore, so let me know what you think this is in the comments. Mike will be seeing them. Keep sending me your spooky scary stories. I will keep adding to this playlist, and while I'm here, they're all going to be mountain lore stories, so keep them coming.